This is in New York, and I'm sitting in the middle of a blizzard, and with me I've got Mary Burkart, an IBVM sister, at the present based in Morocco, and who's been here at our NGO office for some time now. Today is her last day here, and before she goes, we decided to have a conversation about this time at the UN and what it has meant for Mary. So first of all, thank you very much for agreeing to have this conversation. And then if we begin, and if you just tell me, like, from your experience here now at the United Nations, and where you were engaged as a member of civil society, could you just tell me something about maybe some of the surprises of what was new for you from this experience with relation to the UN itself?
I think the biggest surprise was the fact that I wasn't aware that the United Nations really was trying to be involved with civil society. The structures of the United Nations are that it's a forum for nations, and therefore supposedly, or I guess theoretically, people are represented by their governments. And I think since 2012 or so, it's been obvious that doesn't always work everywhere, and that governments may not be actually representing the needs on the ground of all their people. And an input into the United Nations from that forum, from civil society, would be very, very important to bring the issues that have been causing an awful lot of dissension, not just within countries, but globally.
Yes, yeah, that's perfectly true. And I just want to go to a specific aspect of the United Nations, and I think it's an aspect where, I think there's most difficulty. And it's especially about, the complaints we have about the United Nations, and it's probably on the field. And especially, for example, when things don't happen rapidly enough, that's one thing. Another thing is the accusations of abuse, from members of the United Nations forces on the ground. Now, is there anything about the whole complexity of that issue that you might have discovered since you came here, and which I think the ordinary public may not be aware of?
Well, like many big institutions, the United Nations is slow to respond to issues that they may have on the ground, of abuse, of even changing procedures, methodologies on the ground. Also, that if the United Nations is going to ensure that they're protecting people, as happened in Sarajevo and in Rwanda, that they actually do protect them once they've brought all these people together. Otherwise, they're actually setting people up for a massacre. Now, these things are parts of processes that the United Nations is trying to address, but it's very difficult because they occur within specific political contexts where the United Nations doesn't necessarily have the right to decide to fight or to tell its people to start, say, shooting at people or whatever. It's maybe not part of their mandate, okay? And the other real problem is an insufficient number of people in peacekeeping missions to actually maintain peace if they come under attack. So it is very difficult. And basically, I think the United Nations has problems because too many countries can influence what they can do, and they're outside of the area. By the time something actually comes around, you have a lot of dead people, and that's not, I think, acceptable. On the other hand, I'm not sure how that's going to change, Cecilia, because it's a very political issue. And different countries want different things. They have different interests when there are conflicts, and it's difficult. I mean, even, for instance, the refugee situation, not all countries are willing to have the United Nations come in and actually set up refugee camps. And you'd say, well, why not? What's the problem? And the problem has to do with the internal demographics of a country. And you can think, for instance, of the history of Tanzania, where they have brought in refugees going back through the 60s. They had the largest refugee population in Africa. But what they have to do is keep throwing them back out because they're concerned that these refugees will be a destabilizing influence in the country. And of course, the situation of what happened many years ago in Lebanon with the Palestinian refugees there is the case in point. That's the exemplar.
Yes. Yes, it's that is so true, that unless the countries involved allow them in, and this is, I think, what we're often not aware of, on the one hand, that they have to be allowed in by the country, and as you say, you've other powers mediating there as well. And then another thing that I've become aware of recently is that even if you have cases of forces, UN forces, they come from specific countries, but if whatever happens, the UN itself has no power over them. It's when they go back to their own country that then they're supposed to be, that those issues are supposed to be addressed. So I think that makes the whole thing highly complex altogether. So now to move on to civil society. As you mentioned before, the United Nations, it's made up of states. So you have the states, and when we speak of states, it's governments and their people. So, right, then it's all the people. Now, the United Nations doesn't include religions as members. So therefore, people who belong to religious institutions or whatever religion, they are there as members of civil societies, because sometimes that is can be kind of a difficulty when we feel very, feel ourselves very much part of a religious institution, in our own case, the Catholic Church. The fact that we're not as a church, and even the Holy See mission to the United Nations is actually, it's a state, it's not a religion. So then that's one thing. Now, the fact that we're all here, and there are lots of religious congregations like ourselves and other people who are representatives of other religions, now we're all here and we're working. I think the work we do here has spiritual values and an ethical dimension. So I wonder now, would you have been aware if, like that, those kind of values out of which we try to work here, would you think that makes any difference, within the United Nations and within what the UN is trying to do? I wonder, have you picked up anything there since you came here?
Well, I think where it struck me most forcibly was in the idea that there needs to be, that included in the different processes of the United Nations, and this is a general thing, I think it was an ESOP B group or something that was mentioning, well, what about ethics? Okay. And I'm thinking, okay, right, this is the beginning, and then ethics depends on where you come from philosophically, unless you do it from a religious basis. Okay, so I'm wondering, how does this go? And it seemed to me that where this was beginning to come in is, okay, that the representatives of different countries are prepared are beginning to understand the importance of this, okay? And given the history of the United Nations and the world, where the power wins, and then the ethic is actually whatever you want out of whatever you've just done, which is generally money or opportunities for corporations from your country and that type of thing. It hasn't really been anything about, I don't think in general, I mean, and there are exceptions, about the people, what's best for them, or ethically, is it right to do this? And we still have this situation going on, for instance, in the Congo, where all of the rights to minerals there belong to foreign countries. Okay, and what influence does that have on violence, etc.? So what I see is that more nations, and the United Nations itself, are seeing that there is a need to actually base things on something a little bit different, and they're looking at ethics, not necessarily from a religious point of view, but ethics. Then the second thing would have been with the ambassador from Korea, and he made a presentation about global citizenship. And all of a sudden then I was able to see how these things begin to come together. That if you have basic principles, and these basic principles transcend culture, religion, etc., there's something they're very simple, there's something we can all agree on. And if the civil society becomes able to understand these and see how they work within their own cultures, then you're talking about something that will come out globally and that will change the way that civil society interacts with governments and with each other, with other systems. I think that what scared everybody has been like what's happened with the Arab Spring and whatnot. We indicated a lot of people who had been very badly suppressed, okay, they go for freedom, and then things end up much worse than they were before. Okay, so what's happening there? What's happening there is a lack of understanding of the processes that they need to involve and engage in order to actually build a society that is sustainable and peaceful.
Yes, yes. Just what you're saying. The civil society is so important, and the engagement of civil society, at local level as well as at the United Nations level is really important. Now, you've been here for some time, as part of our NGO here at the UN. And would you just tell us some of the things you've been doing, since you came, just so that we get kind of a flavour of it?
Well, doing a little bit of research, which I think was probably more necessary for me to understand things than I don't know if it was any particular value to you. I hope it was.
It was, yes.
I have been, and in the course of that, and in the course of understanding better, what are the things that we as IBVM are focusing on here, and particularly the issue with the trafficking, human trafficking, and specifically women and girls. Really, that kind of really totally affected me, because all of a sudden we're taking like this theoretical thing, we've got all these figures, and the figures blew me out of the water, because it was such a high percentage of, not a high percentage, a high number of people that have been trafficked. And it occurs across so many different ways, not just the obvious ones, and it occurs everywhere. I mean, in the United States, it doesn't matter where. And then our engagement in that, and for instance, the girls, the working group on girls, and then what happened there, that you have young women who are actually beginning to get involved in advocacy and are leading themselves, and I thought their processes in some times are better than ours, okay, because they were more focused and they had outcomes a lot more easily than some of our deliberations. But
yes, that's really interesting. Kind of all the different kinds of involvement. Now, I suppose another part of it, I just wonder if you could maybe, kind of see what you've seen in this respect. It's a kind of, right, we are an NGO here. Now, there are a whole lot of different dimensions to that, different kinds of work you've been part of lots of it, but then you've also, like all the other kind of little bits and pieces of the meetings, the online meetings. Could you just kind of explain a bit of what you've seen as the kind of the different dimensions of the work here?
Okay. Well, basically, obviously, I divided between the actual work that occurs here in New York, okay,
yes.
and the support for that has to happen and has to come from our networks around the world. And without that, really, what are we doing? Okay, so those are as important, I think, as our presence here, the networks that actually help us inform our positions on things and how we react to the different things that are coming up. The webinars are a great way of spreading information, okay, about things that are occurring, say, within the United Nations or not, and I think within the United Nations, or we can do them ourselves, but the point is that all of a sudden you have access to meetings and the general public can actually look in and listen and see if they're interested in the subject. Now, our own networking, I think, is vital, okay, and yes, it's difficult because of it's across, I don't know, every time zone probably on the planet, one way or the other, depending which way you're going, and and it's hard to get everybody together. The technology doesn't necessarily always work everywhere, but I mean, that great example of what happened the last time with Pat Hanby was amazing. I mean, she had no electricity and she had no sort of internet or broadband coming in, and she was one of the few, one of the ones that was able to continue throughout the whole meeting without anything. So, I mean, with a little bit of ingenuity, these things are possible. But the important thing is actually the input. Because if we keep going back to talking about civil society, this is where it's coming from. It's not that we're sitting here with some kind of greater understanding than everybody else. What we have here is the capacity to represent, right?
Yes.
The collective knowledge,
Yes.
or the collective wisdom,
Yeah.
and that has to come from the ground.
Yes, yeah. Right, so thank you very much for that, Mary. It's been, and thank you for agreeing to do this, and let's hope that it will be helpful for our network around the world. That's the idea, having these conversations allows you to, get a glimpse or get a deeper understanding of what we as IBVM are actually trying to do here. So thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Celia.